The security guard's hand was shaking as he reached for his radio. It was November 4th, 1981, 11:43 p.m., NBC Studios in Burbank. Henry Fonda was midway through a quiet, reflective interview about his career, when a man who wasn't on any guest list, who had no scheduled appearance, no clearance, and no business being anywhere near that studio that night, appeared in the hallway outside Studio 1. Coming up, the real reason James Stewart walked into that building unannounced on a night that had nothing to do with him, the specific political argument that had nearly ended their 50-year friendship a decade earlier, and the 5 words he said to Henry Fonda live on national television, that made 19 million Americans forget they were watching a talk show at all. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comments section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much because in a strange way, you're part of our history and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night. Because what almost nobody in that studio understood was that America's most beloved on-screen everyman had spent 10 years quietly grieving a friendship he believed politics had permanently damaged. James Stewart and Henry Fonda met in the early 1930s in New York, 2 young actors struggling to establish themselves on Broadway, and their friendship developed with a specific and immediate depth that would eventually make them, according to virtually everyone who knew both men across the following 5 decades, closer than most brothers, a bond that both men described, in separate later interviews, as feeling almost immediately inevitable despite the ordinary and unremarkable circumstances of their actual first meeting. They shared an apartment during their early lean years, later shared a house in California once both had begun finding steady work in Hollywood, and their friendship survived and deepened through both men's rise to becoming 2 of the most respected and beloved actors of their generation. Stewart building a screen persona around a specific and genuine decency that audiences found endlessly reassuring, Fonda building his own reputation on a similar foundation of quiet moral seriousness that made both men, for decades, symbols of a particular kind of American integrity that audiences trusted completely. The specific texture of their early years together in Hollywood deserves fuller documentation, because it illuminates exactly how deep the foundation of their friendship actually ran before either man achieved significant fame. According to accounts given by mutual friends from this period, Stewart and Fonda shared not only living quarters, but a specific and genuine domestic partnership during their bachelor years, building elaborate model airplanes together as a shared hobby, cooking meals together, and generally functioning as each other's primary source of companionship during a period when neither man had yet found the professional success that would eventually define their careers. This early intimacy, formed before either of them carried the specific weight of fame and public expectation, created a foundation of genuine and uncomplicated affection that both men referenced across the following decades as the truest version of their friendship. A version they both privately hoped, according to what each eventually confided to close friends, might somehow survive whatever public and professional pressures the following decades placed upon it. What almost nobody outside their closest circle fully understood by the early 1970s was the specific and considerable strain that political disagreement had placed on a friendship that had survived nearly 4 decades without significant conflict. Stewart had become, across the years, an outspoken and genuinely committed political conservative, a decorated Air Force veteran who maintained close ties to military and conservative political circles throughout his life, while Fonda had developed into one of Hollywood's most visible and consistent liberal voices, actively involved in progressive political causes and increasingly vocal in his opposition to the Vietnam War during the specific years when that conflict had become the most divisive political issue in American life. Both men had, for most of their friendship, maintained an unspoken agreement to avoid discussing politics directly, understanding, with the specific wisdom of men who valued their friendship more than being right about any particular issue, that their fundamental disagreement on these questions could genuinely damage something considerably more important to both of them than winning an argument. This careful avoidance required genuine and sustained discipline from both men, according to people who observed their friendship closely across the decades, particularly as American political life grew increasingly polarized during the 1960s, and both men's public political engagement intensified alongside it. Stewart's conservatism was rooted substantially in his own military service. Having served as a decorated bomber pilot during World War II and having risen, through continued service in the Air Force Reserve to the rank of brigadier general, an experience that gave his political convictions a specific and deeply personal foundation rather than simply abstract ideological preference. Fonda's liberalism was similarly rooted in genuine personal conviction, developed across decades of thoughtful engagement with American social and political questions, and reinforced by his own son Peter's and daughter Jane's prominent involvement in the specific progressive causes of that era, family relationships that gave Fonda's own political engagement a considerably more personal dimension than casual observers often appreciated. Both men, understanding the genuine depth of conviction underlying the other's positions, worked hard for years to simply set the subject aside whenever it threatened to surface in their conversations together, a discipline that ultimately proved unable to withstand the specific and unprecedented intensity of American political division. During the height of the Vietnam War, this careful avoidance broke down catastrophically at a private dinner party in 1970, according to an account that eventually emerged from a mutual friend who witnessed the exchange. When a conversation about the ongoing war in Vietnam escalated, despite both men's usual restraint, into a genuinely heated argument that came, according to this account, dangerously close to physical confrontation between two men who had never once, in nearly 40 years of friendship, raised their voices at each other in anger. Stewart, whose own son Ronald had been killed in Vietnam in 1969, defended American military involvement with an intensity that reflected considerably more than abstract political conviction, while Fonda, whose opposition to the war was rooted in genuine moral conviction about its human cost, pressed his position with an equal intensity that neither man, in the heat of that specific evening, managed to temper with their usual careful restraint. The argument ended with both men leaving the dinner party separately, and according to the friend who witnessed it, neither man spoke to the other again for nearly a year, an unprecedented rupture in a friendship that had survived every previous disagreement without ever producing genuine estrangement. The specific weight of Stewart's position during that argument deserves fuller understanding, because it explains the particular intensity that made the exchange so much more dangerous than any of their previous political disagreements. Ronald Stewart, James Stewart's stepson from his marriage to Gloria Hattrick McLean, was killed in action in Vietnam in June of 1969, less than a year before the dinner party argument, a loss that Stewart carried with a private and profound grief that friends said he rarely discussed directly even with his closest confidants. When Fonda's opposition to the war surfaced during that dinner conversation, Stewart experienced it, according to the mutual friend who witnessed the exchange, not simply as abstract political disagreement, but as something that felt, in the specific emotional context of his own fresh grief, considerably more personal and considerably more painful than Fonda likely intended or fully understood in the moment. This context, largely unknown to the general public at the time, illuminates why the argument escalated so far beyond either man's usual careful restraint, and why the resulting distance between them proved so much more difficult to repair than either of their previous disagreements across 4 decades of friendship. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because what happens on that stage in a few minutes reveals something about one of America's most enduring friendships that almost nobody ever fully understood. The two men gradually resumed contact over the following years, according to their respective families, though several people close to both of them noted that something in the ease of their friendship had changed permanently after that 1970 argument, a specific and careful distance that replaced the effortless closeness that had defined their relationship for the previous 4 decades. They remained friends, attending each other's professional milestones and maintaining regular, if somewhat more formal, contact. But the particular unguarded intimacy of their earlier decades never fully returned. According to people who observed both men across the following years, each of them privately carrying, according to what both eventually confided separately to close friends, a specific grief about a closeness that political conviction had permanently, if only partially, damaged. By November of 1981, Henry Fonda's health had been declining for several years. A chronic heart condition that had required increasingly frequent medical intervention and that both his family and his closest friends understood, though it was not yet publicly widely known to be seriously and permanently limiting. Fonda had first experienced significant heart problems in the mid-1970s, according to his family, a series of episodes that had required hospitalization and that had gradually necessitated a slower and more carefully managed pace of both his professional work and his private life. He continued acting throughout this period, taking on roles that his family said he found particularly meaningful given his awareness of his own increasingly limited time, but those closest to him understood, well before the broader public did, that his condition represented something considerably more serious than ordinary aging. Fonda himself, according to his daughter's later recollections, maintained a specific and characteristic stoicism about his declining health, rarely discussing it directly, even with close friends, a reticence that mirrored in its own way the same careful emotional restraint that had defined so much of his approach to the estrangement from Stewart across the preceding decade. James Stewart, informed privately by a mutual friend of the specific severity of Fonda's condition in the weeks before that Tonight Show broadcast, had spent considerable time in private reflection about the specific and painful gap that had persisted between them since 1970, a gap that suddenly felt, in the context of his friend's declining health, considerably more urgent to address than it had felt during any of the previous decade's more comfortable delays. Johnny Carson had booked Henry Fonda for that evening's broadcast to discuss his extraordinary career. An appearance built entirely around warm, reflective conversation about one of the most respected filmographies in American cinema history. Nobody on the production staff had any indication that James Stewart intended to make any kind of appearance that evening, and Fonda himself, settling into his usual thoughtful rapport with Carson, had no reason whatsoever to expect that his oldest friend was about to walk into the building. James Stewart arrived at NBC Studios at 11:40 p.m., several minutes before the broadcast's scheduled conclusion, wearing a simple gray suit that hung somewhat loosely on a frame that had grown noticeably thinner with age. The security guard on duty that night, a man who had worked at NBC for many years, later said that something in Stewart's expression, a specific and unmistakable gravity that seemed to carry the weight of considerably more than an ordinary unscheduled visit, made him hesitate before following standard protocol. Stewart told him simply that he needed to see Henry Fonda, that it could not wait until morning, and that he understood completely if this created difficulties for the broadcast, but that he had decided, driving to the studio that evening, that he was no longer willing to let 10 years of careful political distance prevent him from saying what actually needed saying while there was still time to say it properly. Fred de Cordova, the show's longtime producer, met Stewart personally in the hallway outside the studio, and according to the account he gave years later, took one look at Stewart's face and understood immediately that this was not an attempt to insert himself into his friend's spotlight for any reason resembling professional advantage. De Cordova had produced numerous broadcasts featuring both Stewart and Fonda separately over the years, giving him a specific and reliable frame of reference for the ordinary range of both men's public demeanor, and he later said that Stewart's expression that evening carried a specific quality of resolve that he had genuinely never observed from him before, a determination that seemed to have overridden whatever hesitation or careful consideration might ordinarily have accompanied such an unusual and risky decision. This recognition, according to de Cordova, was what ultimately convinced him to take the considerable professional risk of disrupting a live broadcast in progress, understanding that whatever had brought Stewart to that hallway that evening was significant enough to warrant genuine accommodation rather than the polite deflection that ordinary unscheduled celebrity appearances typically received. Stewart told him only that he needed a few minutes and that Henry would understand once he saw him standing there. De Cordova, weighing the genuine risk of disrupting a live broadcast against something in Stewart's manner that felt too significant to dismiss, made the decision to inform Carson during the next commercial break rather than turning Stewart away. Johnny Carson, informed of the situation with barely a minute remaining before the broadcast resumed, made a decision that several members of his production staff later described as entirely instinctive. He told De Cordova to bring Stewart to the stage entrance, not to announce him, simply to let him walk out when the cameras returned from break. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Henry Fonda was mid-sentence, reflecting on an early role from decades earlier when James Stewart walked out from behind the curtain. The studio audience recognized him immediately, and a wave of warm applause began spreading through the room before several people noticed the specific gravity in Stewart's expression, an incongruity that quieted the applause almost as quickly as it had begun. Fonda's face, according to everyone present, registered genuine surprise, followed almost immediately by something considerably more attentive, the specific recognition of a man reading in his oldest friend's posture that something significant was happening. Stewart walked directly to where Fonda sat, and rather than the easy, familiar greeting that might have characterized any other unexpected reunion between these two lifelong friends, his expression carried a weight that made the studio audience go completely silent. He sat down in the chair beside Fonda and said, quietly enough that the boom microphones barely caught it, but clearly enough that it has since been confirmed by multiple people who reviewed the broadcast tape. 5 words that would define the entire remainder of that broadcast. He said, "Hank, I've missed you completely." Several people seated close enough to the stage described the specific quality of his voice in that moment, stripped entirely of the warm, folksy register that had defined his public persona across 5 decades of American film, carrying instead a raw and unguarded urgency that made clear, before he said another word, that whatever had brought him to that stage was going to require more directness than either man had allowed themselves in a full decade. Henry Fonda's expression shifted instantly from surprise to something considerably more vulnerable, the specific quality of a man hearing after 10 years of careful and only partially successful reconciliation, an acknowledgement he had apparently been waiting to hear directly. He asked Stewart what had brought him to the studio that particular evening, his voice carrying a specific gentleness that revealed, in a single question, exactly how much he still valued the man beside him despite a decade of the careful distance that had followed their 1970 rupture. Stewart told him briefly and without excessive detail that a mutual friend had told him about the specific severity of Fonda's declining health, and that this news had produced in him an overwhelming clarity about a decade he considered, in retrospect, one of the great regrets of his entire life. He said that he had led a single argument, however painful, about a subject neither of them could fully separate from personal grief and personal conviction, cost them 10 years of the effortless closeness that had defined the first 4 decades of their friendship, and that he had decided, driving to the studio that evening, that he was no longer willing to let pride or political disagreement stand between them for even one more day than absolutely necessary. He told Fonda, in front of the studio audience and 19 million Americans watching at home, that he had never stopped admiring him, not despite their political disagreements, but including them, understanding, with a clarity that had taken him considerably longer than he was entirely comfortable admitting, that Fonda's willingness to stand firmly for what he believed, even when it meant genuine personal cost and even when it meant risking one of his oldest friendships, was exactly the kind of moral courage Stewart had always claimed to value most in another human being. Stewart spoke specifically about a realization that had crystallized for him only in recent years. Watching from a certain distance as Fonda continued speaking publicly about causes he believed in, despite considerable professional and social risk, a realization that the very quality Stewart found most difficult to accept in the moment of their 1970 argument. Fonda's absolute refusal to soften his convictions for the sake of comfortable relationships was in fact the same quality Stewart had always most respected in the characters he himself chose to play across his own long career, ordinary men who found the courage to stand for something difficult regardless of personal cost. He said that recognizing this specific irony, that he had spent a decade resenting in his closest friend exactly the quality he had spent his entire career celebrating on screen, had been one of the more humbling realizations of his adult life, and that he no longer wanted that irony to stand between them for even one more day. He said that he regretted every single day of the distance that had followed their argument, and that he wanted Fonda to know directly and completely that their friendship had always mattered to him more than being right about any political question ever could. Henry Fonda, according to everyone present, was visibly moved by this point. His own composure, developed across 5 decades of playing characters defined by quiet emotional restraint, giving way to something considerably more open. He told Stewart that he had carried the same specific grief for the same 10 years, that he had never stopped considering Stewart one of the 2 or 3 people who mattered most in his entire life, and that their political disagreement, however genuinely felt on both sides, had never once changed the fundamental respect and love he held for the man sitting beside him. Fonda continued, describing his own private regret about the specific insensitivity of his own position during the 1970 argument, acknowledging that he had not, in the heat of that particular evening, fully considered the personal grief Stewart was carrying regarding his stepson's death, an oversight that Fonda said he had come to regret deeply once he understood, in the years following, exactly what context had made that conversation so much more painful for Stewart than Fonda had recognized in the moment. He said that he had wanted, many times over the preceding decade, to acknowledge this directly to Stewart, but had found himself each time retreating into the same careful political distance that had defined their relationship since the argument. A specific irony that he said he now recognized as its own kind of cowardice, allowing pride and awkwardness to prevent an apology he had genuinely wanted to give for considerably longer than either of them had allowed themselves to admit. Johnny Carson, watching this unfold from behind his own desk, made the deliberate decision, according to production staff present, not to redirect the segment back toward its planned structure, understanding that what was happening in front of him carried a weight considerably more significant than any career retrospective the broadcast had originally been designed to produce. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting an evening of thoughtful reflection, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely moved silence they experienced at a live television taping, watching 2 of the most beloved actors in American history set aside a decade of careful political distance and simply tell each other the truth. Several audience members later described a specific privilege in witnessing this reconciliation, understanding, even as it unfolded, that they were seeing something considerably rarer and more significant than ordinary television entertainment. 2 men whose public personas had long symbolized American decency, demonstrating, in real and unscripted terms, exactly what that decency actually required when tested by genuine disagreement. What followed was a considerably longer and more genuinely emotional conversation than either the audience or the production staff had anticipated. Stewart and Fonda discussing, with a candor neither had ever displayed publicly before, the specific texture of what their friendship had actually meant to each of them across 5 decades, and the particular and painful cost of allowing political conviction, however genuinely held, to create distance between people who loved each other as completely as they did. The broadcast ran significantly over its scheduled time, NBC making no attempt to cut away from what had become one of the most emotionally significant unscripted moments in the program's history. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast, viewers writing and calling specifically to describe how deeply moved they had been watching 2 of America's most beloved actors finally say, in public, the things that a decade of political estrangement had kept unspoken. Several of these callers specifically mentioned their own relationships with family members or friends who held sharply different political views, describing a particular resonance in watching two men whose fundamental disagreement on a genuinely significant issue had never fully erased their underlying love and respect for each other. One caller, a man who had not spoken to his brother in over 5 years following a bitter political disagreement, told a production staff member that he had called his brother the following morning for the first time since their own estrangement began, directly inspired by watching Stewart and Fonda demonstrate that a decade of political distance could still be closed if both people were willing to finally acknowledge that the relationship mattered more than being right. This response, echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of two beloved actors, a broader and genuinely urgent recognition among American viewers, in an era of increasing political polarization, that love and disagreement could coexist if both people were willing to say so plainly. In the 9 months between that broadcast and his death, according to Fonda's family, the two men spoke by telephone with a frequency and an ease that neither had allowed himself in the decade since their 1970 argument. And Stewart began visiting Fonda's home regularly, conversations that Fonda's daughter Jane later described as returning almost entirely to the specific unguarded warmth of their earliest years together, before either man's political convictions had fully formed and before either fame or ideology had introduced any complexity into their friendship. Henry Fonda's health continued declining in the following months, and he died on August 12, 1982, 9 months after that broadcast. According to accounts given by Fonda's family, James Stewart visited him regularly during his final months, and the two men's friendship in that final period returned to something resembling the easy, unguarded closeness of their earliest decades together, a restoration that Stewart himself, in a rare later interview, credited directly to the courage he had finally found to walk onto that Tonight Show stage. Stewart attended Fonda's funeral and, according to multiple attendees, delivered a brief personal reflection that specifically referenced their 50-year friendship without directly mentioning the decade of political estrangement that had nearly ended it, choosing instead to focus entirely on the specific and enduring gift of having known, for the better part of both their lives, a friend whose fundamental decency had never once been genuinely in question, regardless of whatever political disagreements had temporarily obscured it. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Stewart and Fonda's friendship back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage. Years after both men had passed away, when biographers and archivists began examining the full scope of their extraordinary friendship for various documentary and written projects, researchers discovered, among James Stewart's personal papers, a brief handwritten note dated the week following the broadcast, apparently written for his own private reflection rather than intended for any public purpose. The note, according to the account eventually given by a family member who made portions of it available for a biographical project, described Stewart's own private astonishment at how much lighter he had felt in the days following that broadcast. A specific physical and emotional relief that he said he had not fully anticipated given how uncertain he had felt walking into that studio that November evening. He wrote that he had spent 10 years believing that his political convictions required him to accept the loss of his closest friendship as an unavoidable cost of maintaining his own integrity, and that walking onto that stage had taught him something he wished he had understood a full decade earlier, that integrity and love were not in fact in genuine competition with each other, and that the specific courage required to say so directly in front of an audience large enough that neither of them could later minimize what had actually been said, had ultimately cost him considerably less than the 10 years of careful distance had already cost both of them. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the relationships in your own life that disagreement, political or otherwise, may have quietly damaged over the years, and about the specific courage it takes to finally say that the relationship matters more than being right. You do not need a health scare and a television camera to close that distance. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that friendship can survive disagreement if both people are willing to finally say so directly. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the moments when America's most beloved friendships revealed what actually mattered most underneath everything that seemed to divide them. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and telling me about the friend in your own life that disagreement has quietly distanced you from.